Hello everyone, welcome back. About a year ago, we did a video talking about some vintage guitars that we found to be kind of a good value for where they are currently priced in the market. Stuff that is a, great playing instrument and a very usable instrument that is currently going for a price that leads it to be a good value. And you know what? A lot of things change within a year. So we decided to do another. Today, we are going to be talking about 5 vintage and older guitars that we think are a good value right now, that we think are worth your time and money. I do want to note something that is wild as time just keeps passing us by. If you Google just like how old is vintage, the typical definition is anything that is 20 to 100 years old, which I can't back for guitars. Thinking about a guitar that's only 20 years old being vintage is, it's not it. That would literally mean early 2000 stuff is starting to be vintage. But I do think we're at that point where 90s stuff is starting to be part of this conversation, which even for me, and I'm 27, it's really wild to think about. In recent years, I've always considered really anything up to 1989 being vintage, and I kind of still go by that, but as the years pass by, I think 90s are going to be more and more widely considered a part of this conversation. Now, this doesn't mean that 70s or 80s or 90s or even one day 2000s is ever going to be considered part of the golden era of vintage. I think specifically speaking about solid body electric guitars, the 50s and 60s will always be coveted as, the best, the formative years, the years where most of the most iconic models came from. I don't think that that means that all of a sudden 70s are going to be grouped in, but when speaking in general about something that is vintage compared to used, I think as the years pass on, more new stuff is going to be accepted as vintage. I mean, we're even seeing reissues of guitars from the 90s, like Fender recently reissuing the Jag Stang. That definitely says something. In today's video, we're definitely going to be going over a little bit later stuff that maybe wouldn't have been part of this conversation 10 years ago. Also, this video is not investment advice. I'm more so saying that I think these guitars are worth the price they currently demand as far as the value of the guitar. Now, quality stuff does tend to appreciate and hold its value over time, so I think really anything on this list will hopefully hold its value and maybe even appreciate a bit as the years go on. I'm not saying you should go buy these and put them in the closet. This is stuff that I think is worth buying to play and enjoy. Let's get into number 5. Number 5 is going to be the only thing on this list that I don't have an example of, and that's because they always sell when they come in. And that is going to be a Fender Hardtail Stratocaster, specifically from the mid to late 70s. Now, I personally love the Hardtail Strat. I know they're not for everybody, but it's a model that Fender doesn't make all that often, and when they do, it's usually just not in huge production numbers. But you can still get some really cool Hardtail Stratocasters from the 70s for a not crazy amount of money. The price range of a mid to late 70s hardtail Strat can be anywhere from the price of like a newer Fender American vintage reissue guitar up into like the entry level of custom shop. It's not going to be anything too crazy. They're not like cheap by any means, but man, I think these guitars are just a really great value, especially given the lack of other hardtail Stratocasters that are available out there. It's cool to see you can still get these in a similar price range to a non-hardtail Strat from a similar year, when I think these are a little more special. Again, they're not for everybody, but I love the tuning stability and the little bit different sound you get out of a hardtail Strat. It's definitely one of my favorite guitars in the entire Fender line. And the fact that you can still get one that is vintage for a uncrazy price to me is a good value. We actually recently had this example in natural. It was really, really good. I already miss it, but it's gone on to a new home and a good home. That's why we do it. This is probably a good time to mention that if you're new here, we are a shop. We do run this business by selling guitars. So if you are shopping for anything, we would love if you checked out our site at flashfootgear.com or scan the QR code here. Everything that you'll see on the channel for the most part is stuff that we are going to end up selling on our website. That's how we keep doing what we do. Number 4, we do have an example of these older Ibanez musicians, as well as the Ibanez studio guitars from the late 70s, early 80s. These things are absolutely awesome. This particular Ibanez musician is from 1978 and features the Super 88 pickups, which sound absolutely incredible. These pickups are obviously pretty well known now if you're in it with Ibanez stuff or just anything of this era. I think that that is going to continue. A lot of these older Ibanez guitars, again, specifically from the musician range or the studio range, have some really, really great stock pickups that I think are going to continue to be held in such high regard. And these guitars haven't got crazy expensive. It's a pretty big range. You can get guitars from the musician range anywhere from like 1,000 to 2,000. Obviously some examples will go even higher than that. There's even some Ibanez studios out there from the late 70s that you'll find for under $1,000. I think that's a really great place to look if you're looking for something cool, something that is proper vintage, but maybe, you know, doesn't carry a crazy price tag. I think these are kind of slept on to an extent. They're not Gibsons, but they're also not super shreddy. They kind of just take the best of both worlds. And I do with some really great sounding pickups and very nice construction quality across the board. So check these out. These are pretty cool. All right, for number 3, we are going to talk about some acoustic guitars. My pick for this round is going to be the 70s Martin, specifically the D18 and D28. You can still get examples from the 70s for around the same price as a newer modern D28 or D18. This is actually neither of those. This is a D19, but this is an example from that date range, and it sounds absolutely incredible. Obviously, the 70s Martins aren't like the crazy best years of them. The best years of Martin are very unattainable for most of us, but you can still get something from the 70s that is vintage, that has some years on it for, again, a similar price to a newer one. I'm noticing that the 60s Martins are starting to get quite up there in price, and when I kind of first got into buying and selling guitars, 60s Martins were kind of in a similar range to newer ones. So I'm sure eventually that trend will continue for stuff from the 70s. But as I'm making this video, a pretty good value. In 2025, we're now getting to the point that a lot of these 70s Martins are ready for neck resets. For certain people, a neck reset will like kind of devalue the guitar a little bit because it's less original. I think the best value is if you find a 70s Martin that's already had a neck reset done, as that is a very expensive procedure, but it's going to be something that's necessary to keep the guitar playing its best for years to come. I think that's a good investment. These are great heirloom type guitars that are certainly worth buying and enjoying for years to come. All right, so my number 2 pick here, and I should note these aren't in any particular order. This is just stuff that I like. I'm going to go with the Tokai Silver Star line. These are obviously Tokai's Stratocaster type guitars that they were doing in the 70s and 80s. These are really great recreations of some of the golden era Strats. Now the Tokai and Greco Les Paul type guitars have gotten quite expensive, and they're certainly not a hidden gem, but I've noticed that the Greco and Tokai stuff of this era that's more so modeled after Fender guitars haven't gotten as popular yet, but they're really, really great. We actually did a whole video talking about the Greco SE guitars, their Strat copies, and how those ended up actually becoming what we know now as Fender Japan. Go check that video out if you haven't when you're done with this one. Both the Greco and Tokai guitars of that era, specifically the Strat ones, are really great, and they're not super expensive. This one just came in. It hasn't even been set up yet. You've even got your Porsche Cayman S sticker there. Pretty authentic to your original, like this is probably supposed to be an early 70s type design. These are cool. I think these are kind of underrated. I think in the coming years, these are going to be a bit more well-known and probably get up there in price just a little bit. So I think now is a good time to jump on these. Again, not saying this in like the investment sense of you should go buy all these up, but I think if you're looking to play one, I think these are cool and they'll hold their value, and I would check them out. So before we get to my current favorite pick, let's talk about some honorable mentions. This is a nice segue actually from the Tokai and Greco guitars we were just talking about. My first honorable mention, which would have totally made this list, but we actually talked about these a bit last year, so I wanted to change it up to do different stuff. It's going to be the kind of mid to late 80s Fender Japan reissue guitars. Fender Japan being great is obviously no secret at this point, and we've talked about it a ton on the channel, as well as lots of other channels talk about it. In recent years, the JV era stuff, the really early Fender Japan stuff from 82 to 84 has gotten quite expensive and even verges into unattainable territory for some of us, which makes sense due to their historical significance as well as just them being really, really great guitars. But the guitars that Fender made in the years following that in Japan, even though they're still, I would say, historically significant, have definitely not garnered the same like level of price increase. So really anything from like 84 up to even the early 90s. This stuff does retain a lot of the same DNA as the JV era stuff, but it just doesn't carry as crazy of a price tag. And yeah, there's probably some things about the OG like JV guitars that are a bit better here, but I still think these are fantastic guitars, and I'd probably say still undervalued in the current market. This particular example is from the late 80s, and to me, this is every bit as good as like a late 70s Tele-Custom like this is modeled after. This example in particular is a reissue of a 72 Telecaster Custom, which is obviously a classic guitar by today's standards. I think this does a really great job of recreating that guitar. Being that this is already quite an old guitar on its own, it's already showing its wear. It definitely has that kind of vintage feel, if you will. This is another thing that I think in coming years we're going to see go up in price a good bit as these are getting to be more and more well-known. At their current market value, I would definitely not hesitate to check out some of the early Fender reissue stuff from Japan if you haven't already. Now this next one's gonna be an honorable mention because it's not something that I would consider vintage just yet, but that is going to be the Ibanez guitars that were made in Japan in in the 90s that were not part of the Prestige or later J Custom lines. This was just their kind of standard production guitars made in the Fujigen factory. Nowadays, if you want a Japanese Ibanez, it's going to come from one of their higher end lines like the Prestige line or J Custom line. But for a while, they were making a lot of their more standard production guitars in the Fujigen factory. This example was actually Thomas's. This is one of their RG 7421s that was made in 1999. And what's crazy is on the used market right now, you can actually still get these kind of later era standard Japanese Ibanez guitars for around the same price as some of their current production Indonesian and Korean guitars, but the quality of these is way better. I think part of this comes from that Ibanez just makes so many different models and variations that the ones that don't become as sought after, like the RG 550, which is very sought after. Some of the ones that maybe are a little more forgotten or just not as notable don't really go up in value as much, and I think right now are really worth what they're going for. I would be really interested to see in the coming years if this changes or if this era of Ibanez kind of stays as a nice hidden gem of some really great guitars that don't demand a crazy price.
Well, it was hidden and now it's not.
Yeah, maybe it's not a hidden gem anymore now that I said it. I'll say there's a lot of other guitars that fit under a similar umbrella to this from the 90s where they're made in the US or made in Japan, and if they were to make those models now, they'd make them in Korea or Indonesia or China or something like that. So anytime we can find older stuff that's made in the US or Japan, it's always worth checking out because sometimes they're really, really good and don't demand a price that would imply that. So the final honorable mention, which is gonna be one of my favorites of the whole video, is going to be 90s Gibsons. And again, the reason I'm doing honorable mention here is I still can't call these vintage yet, but we're getting there. But these are really, really solid. Specifically the Les Pauls, I really like the specials. I know I talk about these all the time. These were actually called the Junior 2 back in the catalog. These are just super solid guitars. They actually have that like older style Gibson logo here. And this example in particular is very well worn in. Man, I would take this over any of the current production Gibson USA specials. I do like those too, but these are really, really awesome. They come stock with a Tune-o-matic bridge so you can get the intonation just right. And yes, these are not perfectly vintage correct to those of the 50s and early 60s, but they're really great for what they are. I love them for what they are. These are solid. They have pretty thin necks, all things considered, and you know, kind of a blend of modern and vintage correct appointments, even though what is modern when this is a 35-year-old guitar now? These are super solid. They do tend to go for a little bit more than the kind of modern Les Paul special that they're doing out of their original collection line, but less than a custom shop example would go for, so check these out. Also give a shout to this specific example. This is a 1999 Les Paul Standard, so right at the end of the 90s. But we just did another video that featured this guitar, and both me and Thomas were really blown away with this one. It sounds really great. It's got a really comfortable neck profile, and I absolutely love how this one has aged. Yeah, I don't know. There's just something to these like 90s Les Pauls that is always really, really solid. Again, these are kind of go in a similar price range to like a modern Gibson. I would check these out. I'm curious to see how the price changes on Gibson Les Pauls from the 90s as time goes on. Very solid. But also I think a lot of people know that this is a good era. I'll tell you this, people talk about eras of different things being like really perfect or whatever. And now, you know, we've had thousands of guitars come through. We'll find stuff of a year that's not celebrated at all that ends up being fantastic. Or we'll have stuff that comes in from a year that maybe is really celebrated that we go, you know, this is just average. This isn't anything too crazy. We're gonna get down to my number one pick. Again, I'll say these weren't in any particular order, nor is this some sort of definitive list. There's so many cool vintage guitars out there that are great value. Would love for you guys to leave some suggestions down below in the comments and keep the conversation going. My personal favorite pick right now is actually gonna be a bass, specifically Fender 70s jazz basses. Now, this example in particular is from 1970, and this one does demand quite a bit given that it is in that kind of last range of jazz bass from 68 to 72 that a lot of people are kind of after. The more you go into the 70s, the more accessible the stuff gets price-wise. I just really think there's something iconic to this jazz bass, and there's a lot of examples, especially from the mid 70s or even late 70s, that have these aesthetics. They have the block inlays, have the binding, they have this style logo, and you can actually get them for less than like a custom shop version of this would go for, and it is the actual vintage version. But I will say that the later you go in the 70s and the more player grade you're willing to accept, you know, the more changed parts and stuff, the more attainable the stuff gets price-wise. For an example like this from 1970, it's gonna be about the same price, if not a little more, than like a custom shop of a similar specification. But as you get to the mid-70s, they start to be a little less than the custom shop. And by the late 70s, especially if you're getting something with changed parts, you can actually get them for not that much more than like a modern American vintage reissue. I think there's something really special to vintage Fender basses. My favorite bass I've ever played was a 64 precision bass, which is obviously very unattainable for most of us price-wise. But I still think that throughout the 70s, Fender is still making some really great basses that have a very iconic aesthetic and they sound fantastic. I'm a huge fan of these basses. Again, whether it's the 68 to 72 versions or even the late 70s stuff. I think there's a lot of really great basses from the 70s that are still proper vintage, that have quite a bit of years in them at this point. They've survived. Maybe it's survivor bias, the best stuff has stayed around or stayed original. I think there's a lot of really great basses from this era that I really enjoy.
There's a reason Fender keeps reissuing stuff from the 70s, even though people say the 70s isn't good.
You gotta include that. I agree with what Thomas said. Right now, as I'm making this video, you can get the original for around the same price of a high-end reissue. Or get a old jazz bass that is not totally original for a lot less than a quality reissue. That's a cool option too. I've seen refin late 70s jazz basses for sub $2,000. Not commonly, but they come up here and there, and I'm always thinking like, man, if somebody who doesn't care as much about that sort of thing was to buy that, that's gonna be a lifetime type of bass for not crazy money. Well, that's it. That's it for our list today. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us. This is not a definitive list. Obviously, this is not the only 5 or the 5 absolute best vintage guitars to buy right now. Let me know down below in the comments if you guys have any other suggestions. There's so many good ones out there, and I look forward to reading these suggestions and reading your stories. If you haven't already, please don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, share the video, and all that good stuff, because it does really help us out. And with all that out of the way, we will see you guys in another video soon. Bye.